You already accepted a community rewatch. Episode 2. I'm Jonathan. That's Ethan.
I'm Ethan.
All right. Today we're covering season 1, episode 3 and episode 4, Introduction to Film and Social Psychology. Great episode. Not great episodes, but we'll talk about it. We'll see about it. Ethan, what would you say is your big takeaway for season 1, episode 3? Let's start there.
Yeah, so for introduction to film, I feel like this episode, for me the takeaway was like thinking about the beauty of everyday life. That's something that like Professor Whitman is trying to get Jeff to understand, and like that's the point of the class that he's in, Carpe Diem. And like it sounds cheesy, but I feel like that's kind of like a good reminder of watching this episode. And I think that's kind of maybe one of the main themes for me is, especially when you look at Jeff, and really it's like I think a theme for the whole show in general. Like Jeff has this plan to like come into Greendale, kind of just breeze his way through the classes and like get his degree so he can like go back to being a lawyer. He's more focused on already what's like coming up and what's ahead. He's not really focusing on the moment. And especially here early on still in the show, he's not really super focused on just living day to day and enjoying life. We're starting to see that a little more, throughout this early first season. But I think in general for the show and for this episode, that whole idea of, I think that there's some beauty to be found in even the small everyday moments. And sometimes we are so focused on the big picture, especially me, I'm a planner. I look to the future and a lot. I'm thinking about what's coming up next and, trying to stay 3 steps ahead of everything. But sometimes we just got to stop and smell the roses, and like just enjoy the moment that we're in, enjoy the day that we're in. I think that's one of the key takeaways for this episode for me, just because it's kind of a joke that like Whitman's trying to get Jeff to be more like, living in the moment. But I think that's also like an important, like, I think it's actually also a good takeaway, even though it is kind of used as a for humor in this episode. I think you kind of see Jeff maybe start to kind of learn what that means a little bit. I mean, he doesn't really do it like for real. He's trying to just get the A, but I think he probably learns something about that by the end of this episode.
No, I like that. Especially that, like, Kenny, what you said in the middle there of being able to like be in the moment. And as we kind of see Jeff and the rest of the group progress, at the ending, like Jeff is almost stuck in the moment of Greendale, where like people are moving on and people are doing different things and thinking of different ideas, and he kind of wants to almost still be there. And so it almost kind of creates a flip as the series goes on. And I like that too, because even like with the B story of Abed, where like Abed's assignment is a documentary, right? It's not this hyper stylized like make a great moment or whatever. It's look at real life, right? Well, that's kind of what documentaries are kind of meant to do. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
now I like that idea of like, yeah, staying in the moment, creating that thirst for it. And again, Jeff's not going to listen to that now, but as the series goes on, it kind of becomes more real to him. For me, I'd probably say like my big takeaway is this idea of like perception, because I kind of saw it within the different storylines. Like I feel like as we know about Jeff and as we kind of see this, slowly taken down and change, like Jeff is obviously hyper aware of his perception, right? The Whitman has the joke in there. It's like, how long did it take you to look like you have bedhead? Like it's just one of those like little like things that like, oh yeah, Jeff is hyper aware of how he looks, how he's perceived, um, and that we'll see how the story and the show plays with that. But it kind of makes sense, when you're hyper aware of what everybody thinks of you, you're not really able to seize the day. Like you're not really able to live in the moment. And I love that line that Whitman says where he's like, kiss a woman in the middle of the day or run naked through a puddle, but do it for yourself. I remember watching that.
Yeah.
I was just sitting like in my living room watching. I'm like, dang, that hurt a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
He's talking to Jeff, but he's also talking to everybody watching the show at the same time. Like it's,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, come on, Whitman, don't call me out like that.
yeah. And it's like, it's that classic idea of like all the world's a stage. in the sense of we all kind of play into this sense of like, oh, we want to, look like this or act like this. And it's kind of this weird meta question of like, oh, do we ever actually ever do anything for ourselves? And it's, I don't know, it was, yeah, a little challenging, a little like, oh, okay, focus on Jeff, don't focus on me. You know what I mean? But
Yeah, no, yeah, that's good. That's a good catch. Like, I think I agree with you to some extent, and kind of like I mentioned with living for yourself. But yeah, I mean, it's in Jeff's case, he's trying to live for other people's affection. He's not just living for his own enjoyment of things. And I think you can, make that argument that like Jeff is, even the things that he does, it's all kind of a show. I don't think he's really, maybe he's confident in his abilities, but I don't think he's like fully confident in himself, as a person. And again, like you said, like as the show goes on, like we start to see that more fleshed out with Jeff, and like he does have some issues. Like he has issues with his father growing up, and he probably isn't as like secure with himself as like he seems to be right now. You know, so I think that's a good catch, and I think it's a good takeaway for this episode. I didn't know Community was going to teach us anything, but here we
yeah.
are. The more you know.
Exactly. It is a school, I mean, we're supposed to learn
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
All right, extra credit. Little things we noticed, trivia type things. Obviously, throughout the episode, there's a little bit of a reference, an homage to Robin Williams. They have a Dead Poet Society reference about Whitman near the beginning, near his first appearance. And Jeff, he's actually in the lunchroom scene. He's wearing a costume really similar to Robin, that Robin Williams wore in Mork and Mindy, which is kind of fun. The actor that plays the guy that brings in the seven lattes is like a side character from Breaking Bad. This is, I guess Breaking Bad was already on TV, but I'm not sure if he already made his debut on that show since this was '09. But he kind of plays like a similar role, which is kind of fun. And the professor character Whitman kind of plays a similar role. Did you ever see the Jim Carrey movie Yes Man?
I feel like I have. It's probably. I think it's been a long time since I
It's
saw
kind
it.
of a, it's kind of a fun one. Like it's Jim Carrey, Zoe Deschanel are like the two leads. It's probably the last. It's probably the last like major Jim Carrey comedy in a weird way. Like it was because this was like '09 that it came out. So it was, this is way past Ace Ventura and Cableman and kind of all his more famous stuff. This was kind of near the tail end of like his pure comedy run, past Bruce Almighty. But the professor character, Professor Whitman, kind of plays a similar role. In Yes Man as he does in this, which is kind of fun. So, Ethan, what you got for extra credit?
Yeah. So going back to the guy that plays the latte character, or the coffee guy, he's also in the next episode as well. He's one of Vaughn's stoner friends, so he appears in back-to-back episodes. I don't know, like I'm assuming it's supposed to be the same character. Like this guy delivers coffee like in his free time, and then also like hangs out and plays hacky sack and like gets high, I guess, in his free time. But he's also Zeke from The Office, Dwight's cousin and Mo
Yes.
Schroed's older brother. So that's actually how I knew him when I saw him in this episode. Kind of a that guy character. Yeah, and then something I noticed too. I don't know if you caught this, but in the scene with Pierce and Troy where they're in the library and Pierce sits down and is like telling Troy about like sneezing, and he has these two cans of soda that he sits down on the table. There's like a moment where like you see a couple of shots of the two cans of soda, and they're obviously like intact, like he just got them from the vending machine and he sat them down. And then like the very end of that scene, they show him again, and like one of them is like crushed, and like obviously it looks like it's been drank. So I just thought that was kind of odd. Just kind of a goof, I guess, in shooting. And then something else I thought that was weird in this episode that we don't see any other time, I think, throughout the series is Britta sits in a different spot. She sits to Jeff's left. It's like with him on the same side of the table whenever Abed's shooting part of his movie with Jeff and Britta. When the scene when she
Yeah.
gets up and leaves the room, she's sitting to Jeff's left. And I don't know if that's like something we didn't see where like Abed asks her to sit there so he can film them. But it just looks weird because like the rest of the show, like they have their spots. Britta sits next to Abed and Jeff sits by himself at the top of the table. But I just thought that was weird. And then, we do get a little bit of a hint of like Annie's crush on Troy in this episode, where she says she's not going to sign up for the class that Jeff's talking about, and then Troy says he's going to sign up for it, and then he's like, oh, okay, I'll do it. So I'm kind of getting a hint of that. That's kind of a minor storyline later on in the series or later on in the season, not to get ahead of ourselves too much, but those are just a few things there I noticed in this episode that were interesting. Going back to this one, there's some stuff. This episode's like kind of forgettable. I feel like just because like it's right after the pilot and the second episode, it's like you're now into the show and watching this like again. There was some of the plot line that I honestly had forgotten. I guess like it's not one I remembered the whole plot with Jeff and the class with Professor Whitman and him like trying to do all these crazy things. But like the rest of the episode, especially like with Pierce and Troy with the sneezing, like that's not a storyline. I guess I remembered watching this episode, so it must have been a long time since I seen this episode.
Same. I completely forgot about the sneezing. I do remember the Abed like family video that he makes at the end, but I couldn't remember if this was this episode or a different one. And it kind of, it's kind of one of those season one plots that kind of just could fall into a bunch of episodes, but it
Yeah.
works well here. I guess we'll do this quickly because as you mentioned, it kind of grows more as the season grows. With the Annie and Troy thing, I remember like really rooting for that, and even on rewatches, like I did a rewatch, I think a few years ago, probably a couple years ago. And I remember being like, oh, that could kind of work. Now, at the same time, I say that I think that Annie, if they were going to give her anybody, I think like season six Abed and Annie would totally worked. But that's just me. Like that's kind of a personal thing. But what are your preliminary thoughts on Annie and Troy? Like what could have that been? Did you like that? Even that hinting of anything? What do you think?
So I mean, early on, like if I was watching this show from the beginning again, like first time, never seen it before, I could see it, especially because I feel like in this first season and early on, like Troy doesn't really have a plotted out storyline yet. He's kind of just a character there, and even Annie to some extent, but we do kind of see her start to develop her own character development. So like it kind of feels like it makes sense in this first season, just because we do have like later on down the road like that reveal of like I guess we got it in like the first episode where like they went to school together. It's like they're the same age, they know each other. Like then there's like the reveal later of like they were at the party whenever Troy did the keg stand, and like Annie I think like fell through like a sliding door or something, right? Is that, if I remember that right? It's like there's some like
Hmm.
backstory between them, so they knew each other. um and like I think it would have been interesting just because they're so similar in age. But I think looking back now, I'm glad that they didn't try to force it, because I like the growth. Annie is not the same person she was in high school, and neither is Troy. And I think if you would have tried to put them together in a relationship at Greendale, it would have kind of, I think, limited their growth as characters of who they are outside of high school. They're not the people they were in the past. They've come to Greendale and they've changed. And so to that extent, like they're not hanging on to that high school friendship that they had. Now they are friends in Greendale, but it's a different kind of friendship than what, they didn't have a friendship in high school really, because he was the quarterback and she was a nerd. But I think I'm glad that they didn't do anything with Troy and Annie. I like the friendship aspect. I'm happy that they didn't try to shoehorn a relationship in there just because they were the same age.
No, and kind of adding to that, I think that's something that this show does a really good job at because I think again, if this was just another show on NBC or whatever network, I think there would have been a couple shoehorned in relationships. And of course, Jeff and Britta, especially in these early on seasons, kind of have this sort of like will they, won't they kind of thing. But even that, like, I never felt like, oh, this show needs the drama of if is Jeff and Britta gonna end up together this week? Like, the show doesn't really rely on that or need that. And then, like, adding to that, it never uses like fake breakup drama either, or like fake, oh, we got in this huge argument kind of drama. It really kind of focuses on like its larger themes. It's comedy. Well, how is it trying to make you laugh that week? And that's something again, rewatching and just spending time thinking about the show. I'm like, oh, I really like that. That like it's not trying to rely on simple romance, which again, it's fun and like it's exciting and seeing characters together, but it's trying to be more than that, which is really nice. All right, A plus scenes. I'm gonna start this one off. I got Troy. So when Troy sneezes for the first time and everybody hears it, and just like, "Hey, Troy sneezes like a girl," and how about I pound you like a boy? That didn't come out right. That's so good.
Classic Troy.
it's kind of funny because like I remember watching a video just on like community fandom and stuff like that. And the whole Troy trope of like being like, do they do things to your butt is like is like really remembered by fans, which for me, maybe it's just because like I'm not a big fan of like toilet humor slash like butt humor that like it just doesn't stick with me. But like anytime they use Troy like this, where it's like they flip stuff on him, or like it's just like him not quite understanding things. It's like the you guys can say this all you want. I know that popping the back of a raft makes it go fat. Like that's so good. But that's a great one. Probably my favorite line of this episode. Pierce saying to Shirley, I was really moved by your honesty, particularly the part about your husband not being, and he kind of like does like a like a short thing with his fingers when when Professor Whitman confronts Shirley in that in one of those opening scenes. That's just again a little sneaky line by Pierce, but it really works. The scene when Abed, the scene where we first meet Abed's dad, I just think it's a great scene overall. Like I the way it's shot, the the jokes within it. Favorite line in that one, Abed's dad says to Jeff, "You go host American Idol, and you stop messing with my son." Talking to Britta, just got me cracking up. I just thought that that scene overall was really strong, and it really has like a bunch of cool dynamics in the sense of like Jeff's trying to bring Britta out of it. Britta's trying to confront Abed's dad. Abed's just trying to shoot his movie, and like obviously we see the results of that later in the episode. But I just thought that was really strong. So, what you got? A
No,
plus C.
I agree that that scene is a great scene. I think like cinema. What am I trying to say? Like shooting wise, I don't know what the word I'm trying to say is. It just is like it's some great shooting, and I think like the back and forth dialogue. I think that's one of the things that Community does well is like the jokes land. Yeah, like a lot of series have good joke writing. It's like the dialogue and the conversations between the characters and like confrontations or just like when they're talking, like the fact that they can shoehorn jokes into those conversations, but like also have like a conversation that moves the story along. Like that's a hard thing to do. And I think
Mhm.
that this scene is a great example of that, where like there's real story, like it's moving the story along because we're introduced to Abed's dad and we're getting more of like, you know, Britta and him are locking heads and Jeff's trying to pull her out of it, like you said. Like there's also some great jokes and some great lines. I agree like the line about like going to host American Idol. There's a couple of like Ryan Seacrest references for Jeff early on, which is kind of funny. I have a couple of other lines from that scene with Abed's dad too that I want to add that I love. One of them, I think it's like the very like beginning of that scene. Abed's talking to Britta and Jeff about his movie, and he says, "Our first assignment is a documentary. They're like real movies, but with ugly people." And he's shooting Britta, like videoing her during that. It's just like I don't know. It's a really funny, I think, line because I love documentaries, but when you think about it, like I know Abed is just being Abed, and like that's just the way he's saying it. But like it's just funny to say that like normal people, oh, they're ugly people, they're not actors. There's something about that line that gets me. And then at the end of that, you know, which we get later in like Abed's film, you know, where Jeff's like, "I don't want to be your father," and Abed's like, "Great, you already know your lines." There's a great Abed's got some good like comebacks, I guess, or I don't know, not comebacks, but some great responses and some great one-liners, and I like the character of Abed. So yeah, that's a great scene though. I that introduction with Abed's dad and like the confrontation where like Britta's about to like throw hands with you know this like middle-aged guy that's like her friend's dad. I don't know. It's just Britta's
Mm.
crazy and it's a little bit like overbearing in this episode, but you got to respect what she's trying to do. In terms of like a couple other scenes that I thought were really good, or other lines, I guess. Another classic Abed line was 9/11 was pretty much the 9/11 of the falafel business. It's just I don't know. The more you think about it, it's kind of tragic to think about, but it's fun at the same time. And like 9/11 jokes don't usually work, but that one works in a nice, you know, it's not too dark.
Yeah, it feels like it's kind of cushy. Like obviously it's a terrible tragic event, but yeah, in the way they frame it, it's like, oh, that's pretty cushy, and like, okay, it's just falafels, you know, it's not,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
it works. It just hits, you know. And then
Mm.
I, you know, I like the introduction with Whitman. I think coming into the classroom, like that's just a great scene. And then later on, like they're all in the class, and he tells them to get up on the desks, like in the Dead Poet Society callback, and like somebody falls off a desk, which I couldn't tell when I was watching. Was that Britta that fell off the desk, or was that somebody else?
That was an extra. Yeah, I
Okay,
kept
because
looking at that too because I was like, is she supposed to be like significant? Maybe I don't know, but I was looking at for that too in the sense of like, are there any like sneaky actors like, oh, this guy was in this one episode Community and he ends up being like in Avenger or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, or like in the Avengers movies or something. But I don't think there was any like sneaky like cameos or sneaky like, oh, this guy ends up being a super big actor or anything like that. But
not yet anyway. Maybe later.
yeah,
We get Brie Larson later
exactly.
on. Maybe Captain Marvel later, but
Yeah. All right, leading the class. Best of the Greendale Seven in this episode. I'd say Abed. I think really it is his coming out party. He's the emotional button of the show, especially near the end. We get to see why, but I just think you see his quirkiness at full display. You see his personality. You kind of see how like he understands the world, and it's pretty. And again, it does what Community does so well, which is it's funny. Like they use him in a very funny way in this episode, but additionally, it has a lot of heart, and you end up being like, "Wow, Abed!" Like,
no, I got to go with Abed as well. And I don't know if there's really anything else I can say that you didn't say. It's a great like character development episode for him. We already saw some development with him like in the previous two episodes, but I think this is a great one for him to really get a little bit of his backstory. And like there's a lot more to flesh out with Abed that we'll get later on in like the show. And he's honestly probably has like one of the best, I think, in terms of fleshing out his character and his backstory. Like they do a great job of that throughout the show. And I think this is a really important episode for that because we see that dynamic with him and his dad and his mom not being in the picture, which obviously has a lot to do with who he is as a character and his love of TV and film. Like we kind of get a glimpse of early on of why he's so obsessed with TV and movies. That's the way he expresses himself, and he can't express himself the same way that some of the people can. He has trouble expressing his emotions, but he is able to do it through film. I just think that like that great scene at the end with him and his dad, like after he watches the movie, which I don't know whenever you watched it on Netflix, but when I watched it, they didn't have the subtitles for like when he and his dad were speaking Arabic to each other, like what it translated to. But so I had to look it up. But his dad basically says like, "I never blamed you, or I never said I blamed you for her leaving." And Ahmed says, "You didn't have to say it." Like it's that man that hits hard. Like
oof,
man,
oof.
father son moment. Like that's that's a trope from TV, but like father son relationships. I mean, it's such a relatable thing at the same time. Like you can't watch this episode and not get a little bit emotional seeing that, and that realization that I think Abed's dad has that he's been hard on Abed, maybe a little bit too hard. Like after his wife left, after Abed's mom left, but we also see like that relationship kind of get mended a little bit, which is it's a tearjerker. It's a great moment.
Absolutely, gosh. And you're right. On Netflix, and they don't even have in Arabic language. It's just blank and like, oh, that's thanks for looking that up. That's good. Okay, for Marked and Red, this is kind of one of those, and this happens a lot in sitcoms and really any show, where it's it's kind of like I call it the Ant-Man, like Ant-Man from the Avengers movies. I call it the Ant-Man uh effect or the Ant-Man styling in the sense of Ant-Man is a movie that does nothing wrong but nothing great in a lot of ways where it's like if you because I remember like watching that movie and kind of reviewing it in my head. I'm like, oh, okay, the characters were funny, not hilarious. The acting was good, not great. The plot was fun, not particularly intriguing, and all these other things. It's like in a lot of ways, Ant-Man doesn't do anything wrong. It's the Mac Jones of Marvel movies, right? It's not doesn't offend anybody, doesn't throw too many interceptions. It just kind of comes to work
It
and
gets the job
does
done.
exactly. If you need a quarterback for your week, but it doesn't, it's not Patrick Mahomes. It doesn't do anything great. It doesn't do anything special. And I think about this episode in a lot of ways. It has, again, we just talked about the moment with Abba and his dad. That's a pretty special moment. But overall, the episode doesn't do anything particularly special for me, but at the same time, doesn't really do anything wrong. It's just a solid, probably 7.5, maybe 8 if I'm on the right day kind of episode. What about you?
Yeah, I don't have anything that I didn't like about this episode. No nitpicks or anything. I agree. It's a meh episode. It's not bad. I don't hate it. There's nothing that I really even like dislike about this episode. Like, I think the characters all have there's some good lines. I think there's good storyline. You even kind of get like three different storylines. You get Jeff with like Professor Whitman's class, and then Britta and Abed and Abed's dad with his movie making, and then you also get Pierce and Troy, which is kind of like a funny underrated storyline as well, where like that dynamic between Pierce and Troy is kind of always a weird relationship in the show, but I also kind of like their friendship that we see kind of develop throughout the show. So there's some good like storylines. Yeah, I agree. It's just kind of a meh. It gets the job done. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's not like anything that stands out to me that makes this episode like a super. Like I said, I don't really remember much of this episode, I guess, because it's just a kind of a forgettable one. Yeah, I'm okay with it.
All right, on to Social Psychology, season 1, episode 4. My big takeaway for this one is the idea of using friendships. I feel like that's kind of the big like theme, if you will, or the active theme. So like Jeff is using his friendship with Shirley to vent about his feelings against Vaughn. Obviously, Britta and Vaughn kind of have their moment, have one of their moments within this episode. And at first, Shirley is, nice to Jeff, and they want to have like this little chat, or she wants to have this little chat on their way to the next class. And Jeff's like, I have no idea what I want to, how to talk to Shirley, which is kind of funny because like they're around the same age, I'm pretty sure,
Yeah.
but it's just like, and I guess at the same time they have nothing. Shirley's a church going lady with 2 kids, and gone through a divorce, and Jeff is this hotshot, cool single, you know, acting like an alpha male lawyer. And so like they don't really have much to communicate about, but they end up kind of creating this friendship out of, Jeff really just in the desire to rip on Vaughn, which is kind of funny. And then we have Annie kind of using friendships with Troy and Abed for her experiment. And I want to ask you something. Did you notice? So there's this little moment where when Troy breaks, and it's used as comedy, like, he's like, what are you doing, Annie? Like, we've been here for 3 hours. I'm so bored. Like the whole thing. Did you notice like a little bit of that while Troy is breaking, they flip the camera on Annie, and like she goes from like intrigued to like kind of heartbroken.
Yeah.
There's like a brief moment in there where she's like, "Ooh," like it's just like that visual of like, "Oh, I kind of feel bad about this. Maybe I shouldn't have done this." But obviously, the experiment continues, and I just kind of like that idea of like she kind of recognizes, "Oh wow, I kind of used my friendships in this for my own personal gain." And again, she didn't know the consequences or whatever, and probably didn't like really think that forward, but obviously with the Annie and Abed thing, where Abed eventually broke them, and and it's kind of neat where Abed's like, well, you said we were friends. That's what friends do, right? Friends are there for each other and help each other, and it's kind of like this really convicting moment for Annie. But I thought that was kind of added to the theme there, and then also Jeff using friendship as a reason to kind of stay close to Britta. Obviously, Jeff is still into Britta at this point in the series, and as she kind of gets to know Vaughn, he's like, "Oh, let me protect her from Vaughn." But he's and again, he's playing the part of a friend, but he doesn't want to be that level of friend, as we see later in the episode, where he's like, "Yeah, I don't want to hear about the guys you date and stuff like that." And so it's kind of this weird thing of like he wants to be really close to Britta, but at the same time, he doesn't want to be that close to Britta, but obviously he wants to be romantically close to Britta, and it's like this whole thing of he doesn't really understand what he wants. What about you, Ethan? What do you got?
Well, I don't know if I can really top that because that's kind of what I was going for as well. I think friendship is a big um, theme in this episode and throughout the first season as well. And I think adding on to what you said about like this episode being about using friendships, I think that's a good way to put that. But also on top of that, like we see like Jeff using his friendship with Shirley, like kind of for like bad reasons. And there's kind of underlying motive. Like they are friends, but like there's not really good things happening because they're gossiping about Vaughn, and it's kind of a toxic friendship, I guess. But at the same time, like we do see them like develop that relationship by the end of this episode. Like they realize that they can be friends. Like that's what makes their friendship great. Is like they both like gossiping about people, and it gives them a chance to. And like obviously not like a great quality to have. Like that's just Shirley's character. She's a gossip, and like I still think seeing that friendship between Jeff and Shirley blossom. We haven't seen it up to this point, and we don't really see it a lot throughout the show. Like you're right, they are close to the same age. It gets brought up like honestly a lot where Shirley is defensive and says, "Hey, Jeff and I are the same age, or close to the same age." But for two people that are very different, as you said, a mom of, two boys versus like a hotshot single lawyer, that they can still have a friendship and find some kind of connection and grow a relationship. And then same for like Annie and Abed, where she's young, she's just out of high school, she's a go-getter, but she's also very insecure and is trying to grow past who she was as a high schooler and her Annie Adderall identity. And Abed, who's just this, quiet but kind of kooky guy who's very likable, a kind, loyal guy. And they don't really seem like you don't look at them and identify that those are going to be friends. But like we see that friendship develop in this episode, where by the end of it, Abed tells Annie that he came to the experiment just because he thought she said that they were friends and he wanted to be loyal to her. And Annie kind of has that realization that she kind of used him. But even if it takes some lessons learned to get there, like we see two friendships and relationships develop that we didn't previously see through the show. And I think that's a great part of this episode, is just finding friendships with people who you might have taken for granted previously. Jeff probably didn't look at Shirley as somebody who he'd ever really have a relationship with, because they're similar ages, but they're at different stages in life. They're close in age, but like neither one of them have like, they're both like complete opposites basically. And same for like Annie and Abed. They're closer in age, maybe a little bit similar in like stage of life, but they're just different personalities. But the people that we might take for granted or overlook sometimes can end up being great friends if we make it work, and find those common grounds and build those connections. Sometimes people are just underappreciated. We don't appreciate people enough, and we're missing out on some, I think, good friendships, good relationships with people that we don't give a chance.
That felt like a ending of like a community episode. That was good. I just imagine like like that was good. And actually, kind of speaking of that too, like the funny thing, and I'll bring up Annie and Abed and Shirley and Jeff here, but like Jeff and Shirley are kind of both a little vindictive, kind of both a little like calculated, and because we see like Shirley, she plans a business. Along the way, she's willing to, stab some people behind in the back in some certain situations. Like they're both kind of calculated and really, kind of willing to do what they need to do to kind of get things done. And like kind of like you said, like, you know, until you get to know somebody, you don't know, oh, they kind of think the way I think, in a lot of ways. And kind of with the Annie and Abed thing too, where it's like we know with Annie's backstory, like she was a nerd and in a lot of ways she was a victim of just bullying and just not being one of the cool people. And then like Abed, we know that for a fact that, he's kind of weird and socially awkward and not, just an observer, not really an active player. And we kind of, and we, yeah, like you said, we kind of see both those relationships really kind of get their first bit of water and sunlight there. Extra credit in this episode. So this is kind of funny, but Britta and Vaughn, they have like this little micro conversation when we first both see them on screen, and it reminds me of something that they do in Rick and Morty, which in Rick and Morty, there's always like a bunch of like little background conversations, like in party scenes or whatever. And there's one in particular. It's just obviously with Rick and Morty, it's like a bunch of aliens and stuff like that. And it'll be like, don't put a schmoopy doop and a loopy schmoop in the same place. And like one guy's like, yeah, for sure. And it's just like, it's just funny how like that something that Darren Harmon did in 2009 is actually still affecting his work now. And the conversation they have is kind of funny because like it's about like pandas. They're like Vaughn's like, and I told the panda to put his pants down, and like there it is, like panda, like, and it's just like having this weird like conversation about like the sexuality of pandas, which is just like very like it again, it's very like Dan Harmon background conversation kind of thing. I thought that was great. And then I think you might have saw this too, but the Luis Guzman statue at the end was kind of funny. And it's like, oh yeah, like we know that. What
Yeah,
you got?
that Luis Guzman statue, I noticed that at like the ending of this episode, it actually doesn't get unveiled until the next episode. So a little bit of a weird like continuity error. We see the
Okay.
statue, but in the next episode of the show, we actually see the statue get unveiled. So kind of odd, but it's kind of funny. And yeah, the Luis Guzman statue is a great part of the show. I love his appearance later in the show. But something I noticed in this episode, it's the first time we see Garrett.
Yeah.
I had to go back and look at that, but it's the first appearance of Garrett one of my favorite characters in this show, just because he's got so many great lines and he's hilarious. And then Vaughn. So I want to shout out Eric Christian Olsen, plays Vaughn. He's the actor. I knew him before I watched the show. He was in NCIS Los Angeles, which was an okay show, but like I watched it quite a bit growing up. It was one of those shows, NCIS Los Angeles, Criminal Minds, like those like crime shows. He was in that, and he was like a kind of similar. Like I feel like if Vaughn became a cop, that's what basically like his character in the show was. Wasn't so much like a hippie, but was just kind of like this goofy, like he's smart, but like kind of like also a doofus and like kind of the comedic relief a little bit. I feel like he plays the hippie character really well though, because he has that look. And I mean, he's kind of like you're not supposed to like him because he's like Jeff's enemy, so to speak, in terms of his pursuit of Britta. But he's also, I don't know, he's kind of likable. I think you just kind of feel like he's just this weird, like he fits in with the college scene well. He likes to play hacky sack. Probably likes to get high. He got tiny nipples, so like he's just he's an interesting character. And I don't know. He's just I think for him to be like the love interest for Britta and like that kind of antagonist for Jeff, like early on in the show, I like the dynamic just because like Jeff and Vaughn are so different. I think Vaughn's a pretty good character. I mean, again, you're not really supposed to like him, but in like the same time, I think that means he's playing the character well if you don't like him. So shout out to Eric Christian Olsen, the actor.
A plus lines or scenes. This one still cracks up my brother and I. But when Chang in the study, he says, "What community college professor can't make $80?" My brother and I still laugh about that. The experiment itself, especially how confident Duncan acts to the research participants or the research developers with him, where he's like, "We're gonna have a good old fashioned like crazy off." He's like, boom, like just doing the fake shotgun, like he's just like such in his element. It's just so funny, and like it's kind of funny too because like Duncan, he kind of shrinks like in the pilot. We see Duncan and Jeff communicate a lot and in the same spaces a lot, and he kind of shrinks in those situations, and in different situations throughout the series he shrinks. But in this, like with amongst his like in his element, and then when he's doing research, he's just so confident, and it's kind of fun to see him kind of act a little bit of a different way in this. Oh, and then Jeff talking to Britta about the friend zone. This was, I thought at first I was just going to bring up the one line, but that whole little section, it's probably just a 1 minute scene, but I think that really worked in the sense of like, it's a real showing of like kind of what the friend zone looks like. Where like, I want to be a friend with you, but you I want to be with something more. And he says that line, is there a space between on the friendship spectrum between total stranger and not hearing about the guys you date? And I remember just writing to myself in my line like, relatable. Ooh, relatable. Oh gosh, what about you?
Yeah, that's a great exchange. And I mean, you kind of feel for Jeff because we know at this point that he's chasing Britta, but it's a good. I don't want to say. I mean, it is growth. Like we obviously know that the dynamic between Jeff and Britta, like that's gonna get fleshed out more throughout the first season. It's like it's not done, but like at least for this episode, he takes the L, but like there is kind of like some hope in that where she still wants to be friends too. And it is, again, it's weird. We talked about this in the first episode. It's weird seeing first episode Britta from everything else because in the first episode she really doesn't seem to like Jeff at all.
Mhm.
She kind of gets some respect for him, but she really doesn't seem to like him because she sees through his fake act basically and sees him for who he is. And then all of a sudden, like in the second episode and the third episode, like now she is okay with being friends. Like they have a really good relationship and a good friendship. It's just odd to see that. But I do like that scene with Jeff and Britta because I think that's kind of relatable for anybody who's kind of been in that spot where you've had somebody who, you're friends with, but you also have those feelings for. It's a hard part of life, but we all go through it at some point. Other things that I really enjoyed from this episode, in terms of lines, there's I think it's Troy that says it. I don't remember. I didn't write it down. I can't remember who says it, but it's during the experiment scene. and he says, when you say something starts at 9, it starts at nueve. Actually, I think it's Chang. Now that I say that, it's a Chang line.
Yep.
It says, when you say something starts at 9, it starts at nueve. Like, that's relatable to me because I hate when stuff doesn't start on time. Like if it starts at
Yeah,
9,
same.
if you say it starts at 9, you better start at 9.
Yeah.
Like family dinners, if they say we're eating at 5, if it's 5:15 and we're still like sitting around talking, like I'm gonna be mad. So
Yeah.
that line was relatable to me too. The whole Chang meltdown is honestly I think it's probably the best scene like of this episode. And we haven't seen Chang, like we didn't see him in episode 3 at all, I don't think. We see him a little bit in this one. But again, he steals the show and he's like a great actor. And then like Duncan's meltdown too, when he kind of at the end is like throwing a fit. I think those those scenes show just how great John Oliver and Ken Jeong are at like the acting, because they can deliver great lines that we see throughout the show where they just have very great like delivery, but like then like kind of the physical comedy of like their breakdowns is also great. So like it just kind of makes them like just well-rounded actors. I love that Abed sees himself as Phoebe, because he and Annie have that conversation where he's like, I always saw us as more of like a Chandler and Phoebe. We don't really have any kind of like storylines. And then she says something. He's like, all right, something about, he calls her Chandler basically and says she's Chandler. It's such an innocent like,
I'll help you, Chandler.
He sees himself as Phoebe. But like honestly, like I thought about that afterwards. Like I kind of like see it. Like he does definitely seem like a Phoebe. They're both kind of eccentric characters, kind of misunderstood, but lovable. And you kind of, they're weird, but like you also can kind of relate to them because they're their own person and they don't really care what anybody else thinks about them. I just love it. It's such an innocent, like, aw moment, like you're Shirley and Annie, aw. And then, you mentioned earlier the whole Troy and his obsession with butts. And it's kind of like a weird, there's a couple of other lines I feel like throughout the show where Troy mentions like stuff about butts. And when he's having his breakdown, like earlier in the episode, obviously he asks like, is there gonna be butt stuff? Do they pay you extra if they do stuff to your butts? He's just like very obsessed with it. And then during his breakdown, I don't know if you caught it, but like when he's running out of the room, he says, or not running out of the room, but I guess like crawling out of the room. He says, you promised butt stuff. Like that he's crying, like yelling that. I don't know. It was funny to hear him say that again, just because it's, I don't know what, I know what the joke is about, but it's just a funny thing that Troy is so like, that's kind of his thing that they talk about a lot with him. And then another great line, last one for me, whenever Garrett gets up to leave the experiment, Duncan tells him, go kill John Lennon, you loser. I lost it at that line because Garrett looks like the guy who killed John Lennon. I don't know if you've ever looked up the man who killed John Lennon, Mark David Chapman. If you have time, look up the picture sometime. Like he looks exactly like Garrett.
Oh, wow.
Which I watching before I watched the show, I'd seen pictures of this guy. And so when you see Garrett and he says that line, like, oh my gosh, they look exactly alike. It's just it's a kind of a dark line, but it's funny. It works.
That's hilarious. Gosh, I'm gonna look that up after this. That's great.
If there was a movie about John Lennon and Mark David Chapman, they got to get the guy who plays Eric or Garrett. Oh my gosh. I think his name is Eric, the actor. They got to get him to play Mark David Chapman.
Leading the class, best of the Greendale 7. I'd say, and this happens throughout the series, sometimes, again, with an ensemble cast, there's not like a particular actor or particular performance that really stands out. And in those situations, since like Jeff kind of does the most in the series, kind of like the Tony Soprano of the series, I'd probably say Jeff for this episode, where, again, it's kind of like last episode as a whole, where good things, not necessarily great things, but just consistent, solid. So I'd probably go Jeff there. What about you?
Yeah, I don't know if there's really a character that gives me a lot of stands out, I guess, above the rest. I'd say maybe Annie, just because of the development we see in her friendship with Abed, and just even from the beginning of this episode to the end, where she really cares about getting in on this class because she's obviously she's the character that wants straight A's. She wants as much experience and she wants to learn as much as she can. She's kind of a teacher's pet. She really wants to be in this experiment with Duncan, right? And so she's asking Troy and Abed to be in this experiment to get people to come so that she can look better to Professor Duncan. And then obviously at the end of it, she's learned that she kind of took advantage of Abed and Troy, and she kind of feels bad, and that kind of strengthens their relationship. She understands that Abed sees her as a friend, and he trusts her, and he likes being friends with her. And I think she's kind of, because she gets her own storyline in this one for the first time, really, I think in the show so far, I think she stands out just because it's kind of her first big shot in the show where we kind of start to see her more as a character and her interactions with Duncan and Troy and Abed. There's some great moments and some great acting there from Allison Brie.
And lastly, Marked in Red. I think we both had the same thing on this one, but the opening again, I feel like I should have maybe like done some research on this because I feel like that was just like a storyline that they dropped because they liked something else. But the opening where Chang, which is a great Chang scene, but when he's like, but there was one comment so cruel and racist, and I love how like they just use like racism in this show. Like it's funny, but but he and then he obviously points out Annie and like gives her like a creepy kiss on the forehead, which I love the idea of that scene, and I think it's a really funny like scene, but at the same time they don't do anything with it. There's no consequences to it. Do you remember that? And yeah, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that scene was a bit of a. It was kind of hard to watch. I do think it kind of seems out of place, and it's the cold open kind of scene. So like I kind of get there just throwing it in there to like show Chang being crazy. But like most of the other episodes of the series, when they have like the cold open, it usually has to do with the plot of the episode. And like we don't see anything else about this ever come out again, like where Annie is writing this critique of Chang. And you know, I love Chang, I love the character, and I love how crazy he is. But the whole him being in her face, and then he kisses her forehead, it's not even like that it's like a creepy like why is he kissing her, because like it's supposed to be funny of like he's like I don't know, it's just but it doesn't work for some reason for me. It's just it's weird. It's a weird scene. It's kind of bizarre. It doesn't really it feels out of place in this episode. I feel like it would work better in one of like the later episodes where we see Chang more like prominently featured as like especially when his side of a teacher starts to become more like part of the story. I feel like it would have worked better with that. It doesn't really fit with the rest of the episode.
Another thing here, which I went way too deep on this mentally, because I remember watching this. We talked about this earlier with Vaughn, where you mentioned this earlier, where Vaughn's supposed to be the kind of annoying, unknowingly lame stoner, and it's kind of this weird thing of like he's again, we're not necessarily supposed to like him because he's kind of Jeff's adversary in this, but like at the same time, he doesn't do anything specifically unlikable. Where it's like he's not mean to Britta or mean to anybody in the seven. We don't see him like being mean to random people or whatever. And it's kind of this weird thing where we've seen this character before. He's the earthy, like 2003 California cool. Like he's the cool side of weed smoking. He's the cool side of that kind of guy in college. And but at the same time, it's just like it just bothers me. And it's like it's one of those things in the episode where I'm like, am I supposed to not like him, or am I supposed to be rooting for Jeff, or am I supposed to like have this moment of like, oh no, Jeff is the one that needs to change because he's the one that's being bitter, not being a good friend, and all this. And and again, like with Vaughn, it's one of those things for me where like he's unknowingly lame. So I remember I met this one kid. It was like, so it was me and a group of friends. Like we all went to church, and afterwards we had lunch, or whatever. And this one guy who I wasn't friends with, my friends invited him. He was like, "Oh man, what a great message today!" And like it was just the guy was just. I mean, you can smell the Bible college off him. Like he was just fresh out of there, and he was like. He pulled out his phone and like started to read like this whole thing about like the medical definitions and the medical like explanation of like the Roman crucifix. And I literally left the car. I was like, I have to use the restroom. I just got up and left and like was gone for like 5 minutes. Like he's probably done now. Just walked back. I'm like, it was like that kind of thing where like he was so like unknowingly like unknowingly lame and like just kind of annoying. And it was one of those things where like if in like in the show, like when they kind of crush Vaughn with like when they read his letter, it's like, oh, like I kind of feel bad for Vaughn, like he didn't deserve that, and he's kind of walks away like a puppy dog. It's like the same thing. Like if I would have called that guy out and like, hey, okay, I know you want to hijack your conversation for just to prove something, I don't know, but like stop reading your whole thing on the medical background of the Roman crucifix and just enjoy your lunch. He would have been like, ow, what the heck? And people would have been like mad at me. I'm like, hey, he pulled it out of me. I don't want to be here. But it's just kind of this weird thing with Vaughn. But like you said, the fact that I probably don't like him a little bit is probably a sign of good acting, a good written character. So that's I spent way
Yeah.
too much time thinking about that, but go
No,
ahead.
I think that's supposed to be part of the character. Is like he's supposed to be lame, like because I think for his character in this storyline, I think we're supposed to see Vaughn as like, he's obviously very, I mean, he's supposed to be a lame guy. And I think that's the whole Jeff is struggling. Why is Britta after this guy, not me? I think it's there to help the story move along. But I mean, there's also some comedic parts of that where we all probably know somebody. I mean, not exactly the same personality of like into the same things as Vaughn, but we've all been around somebody who we kind of lame, and you kind of feel for them, but at the same time, it's kind of like you're just scratching your head, what's going on. And I think that's kind of what he serves to be. I don't think you're really supposed to, again, you're not supposed to like Vaughn, I don't think, but I don't think you're supposed to like hate him. He's not like a bad guy. I'd say also for me in this episode, something that well, really just the whole episode, I guess. There's nothing like specifically. This episode doesn't really work for me. I'm not a huge fan of this one. Something about the whole like Vaughn and Britta and like that plot with Jeff. It's a weak plot. And with him and Shirley and like the gossip, I don't know. It's the whole episode feels really weak. It doesn't really feel like there's anything that like carries it besides like the Chang like breakdown scene, which is like funny for comedic effect. But like overall, in terms of like plot and storyline, I mean, you get that friendship development between Annie and Abed, which I talked about, and that kind of that growth too between like Britta and Jeff, where like we're kind of seeing their relationship change a little bit. I mean, those are strong. Like, there's obviously importance there for the rest of the series, but overall, as an episode, it's probably one of my least favorites from season one, just in terms of it's pretty slow, kind of boring, not a lot of, I feel like, anything redeeming out of it that makes me remember it. And the experiment, the same thing, like the plot for the Duncan experiment, like it's funny, but overall it's just kind of a weak episode. I feel like, I don't know if you agree or not, but this episode just kind of low on my list for season one, I guess.
Well, I'll tell you what. I had this in my head. This episode was better than when I rewatched it. Because in my head, I was like, "Oh yeah, the Duncan experiment episode, and yeah, that was good." And I remember watching that and like, "Oh, I'm just not laughing as much as I thought I was going to." And I'm not laughing as much as I one predicted, but also one remembered. It was weird. So as I was watching this, I was like, "Okay, this is not quite what I thought it was going to be." And yeah, overall, I agree with you. It wasn't. It just it wasn't as strong. Again, I might be the victim of my own expectations, but yeah, it wasn't very strong episode. I agree there.
We got some
Anything
better
else?
episodes coming up though, so
Yeah, for sure. Oh, so were you looking ahead a little bit?
just a little bit. I was just trying to like remember kind of how the first season goes. I didn't want to peek ahead too much, but I was just trying to see, especially because after this one, it's kind of a disappointment of an episode. It's so weak. I don't know, but yeah, there's some stuff on the horizon. There's some other good ones in the first season that keep it going. So I can forgive this one a little bit.